Marie Lightfoot, who is a true crime writer, she really harkens back to, I've traced her clear back to when I was 23 years old and first getting out of journalism school. I like to say that the first seed of the Marie series has come from when I was stopped by a cop. I was 23 years old and I was covering a city council meeting, and I came home one night late from a city council meeting and I saw a big white police car in the rearview mirror with the light going around. And I was nervous because, well, you are if you get stopped by a cop, but I knew I hadn't been doing anything wrong. And I got more nervous when the man who got out of the car was a huge young man in plain clothes. And the streets were deserted, it was dark. He walks up to my car and he told me I'd been speeding, and I knew I hadn't, so out of some foolhardy impulse, I asked him for identification. Instead of answering me, he went around to the back of my car and made a show of examining my license plate. And I was getting really scared. And he came back around. Again, I asked him for his identification, and rather than answer me, he said he was letting me off with a warning. So he got back in his car and he drove away, and by this time I was trembling with my hands on the wheel. Well, this was a long time before the days of cell phones, so I got to a telephone and I called the police department. I had hardly gotten the words out to the police dispatcher before she said, "You too?" It turns out this young man had stolen the police chief's car and was going around stopping people that night. Now, it ended grimly for him. He was stopped at a roadblock and shot that night. He wasn't killed, but he was shot. Well, the reason this was a seed for my Marie Lightfoot series is that the next morning I found out the story behind the story. And the story behind the story, which didn't come out for 20 years and has since come out, is that the young man had had an assignation with the police chief that night. And he had stolen the police chief's car keys, car, gun, and badge. And this was the late 1960s. It was Kansas. The police chief was a married man with children. And when I heard this, all I could think about was the effect on him and his family. And I made a choice not to even tell my publisher, which also told me I was probably not cut out to be a journalist. But what I learned through that one episode was that the story that doesn't make it into the paper is often the one that's of greatest human interest of all. And I know that that's a seed behind my eventual decision to write a series in which I have a true crime writer who writes the facts and the story that goes into print, and then that is set in the story of the real story underneath. And it all went back to when I was stopped by a cop, or not a cop.
Well, I think that's probably the difference between a writer and a writer's imagination and the rest of us who would probably have, written it off or gone home and told 8 friends, and that would have been the end of it. But I do see now, because that was the next question I was going to ask you, and you've kind of answered it, is why you have elected to write the Marie Lightfoot so that you alternate, or not alternate always, but anyway, you have chapters of her actual narrative, I mean, whatever the true crime account that she's going to do about this incident. And then you have her as the detective, so you wind up with 2 voices, but you wind up with what is purportedly the nonfiction part of the book, i.e. Marie's journalism, and the other. And I sort of wondered why you were doing that, but now I can see.
Yeah, I was also fascinated by a period when I volunteered to be on a Mystery Writers of America Edgar committee, and our job was to judge the best true crime book of the year, and that would have been nonfiction, a book about an actual crime. And I did that because I thought, well, I would learn a lot about motivation. I would learn why victims become victims, and I would learn why murderers become murderers. And so I read 40 or 50 books that year along with the rest of the committee, and to my absolute amazement, I didn't find that out at all from those books.
Really?
There was one book that year, and I will say this is a year that Ann Rule did not have a book out, but there was one book that year that satisfied those questions for me, and that was The Preppy Murders by Linda Wolfe.
Right.
It didn't even win the award that year, but that was the book that did it for me. And I really had to think a long time about that, about why that would be, that books purporting to write about true crime wouldn't tell me why those crimes had occurred. And I got to thinking about how difficult it is to tell the whole truth. Because if you're dealing with murderers, I think we'd agree they're probably not the most introspective people on the face of the earth. And if they're on death row, they want out. They're still not going to tell the truth. If they tell the truth, they may be manipulating the people who ask them. Families need to be protected. Innocent people need to be protected. Writers can be afraid of being sued. There are a million reasons, good reasons, why you might not be able to get at the whole truth. And that was really interesting to me. So that entered into it too, my desire to show, I guess I have something of a desire every time I see people reading a newspaper, to say, don't believe that's the whole story. Don't accept that at face value. There is so much that you're not reading in the newspaper about whatever it is you may be reading. There's so much that doesn't get into the paper. Just maintain a healthy skepticism about everything in regard to that, or at least, if not skepticism, at least know that a lot didn't get in there. And so that fascination for me, with the difference between the surface facts and the truth that lies underneath, out of that came a desire to write those two different stories. I found that writing in the true crime style, this book that Marie writes, is really fun. That is, those books have a particular kind of style. As you know, they're kind of personal between the writer and the reader. They're a little overheated. They like to get pretty dramatic. And it's a style that's real entertaining to write. And I like to read them too now. And then but the style of Marie and her life and what's going on with her has to at least be somewhat distinguishable from that. So I have two different voices speaking in the books, in effect. Two writers' voices in the books.
You do, and yet it's the same writer.
And yet it's the same writer, yeah.
And I did think in your second book, Ring of Truth, the one that you've come to sign for us right now, you had a really interesting and vivid description of what it is, what a writer's life is like the last couple weeks of trying to make a deadline, how trash the house is, how the bills go unpaid, how, you know, nourishment is just by chance. A shower is probably an unfamiliar part of the appliance at the home. You know, and I thought, boy, isn't that true? Because I mean, I have many deadlines all through the year when I have to get things out, and that really is. I mean, down towards, I can hardly stand myself.
And it's very difficult for other people to be around us at that time.
Well, I positively repel them and all, but I mean, every once in a while I have to say to myself, you know, I'd feel better if I took a shower.
Yeah.
Or, you know, maybe it's time, you know, that I made myself some coffee or did something or other, because you just get so absorbed in it.
I call it the writer's trance.
Yeah.
And you can go into the writer's trance for 15 minutes, or you can go into it for weeks at a time. When I'm really deep in it and I'm writing, I know that I've been in it only when I come out of it. And that's when my outer senses come back to life. And I hear things that have been out there the whole time, birds chirping, and I suddenly begin to hear them again, or I see things going around me. And I know at that moment I've been gone. And it's a funny state to be in that writer's trance, because there's no pleasure, or there's no way to describe it as pleasurable or unpleasurable. You are just gone. You are doing whatever it is you were doing, lost in the writing, and then you come back out and life resumes. Now, when I'm being a hermit, as Marie is in The Ring of Truth, and she's just finishing a book, that can be kind of hard in the sense that I think we tend to really steer away from other human beings, and a lot of us get a little crazy by that time.
Well, you'd have to. I mean, you know, from her description, and certainly from that, you can get physically repulsive if nothing else. So who wants to be around you? But I thought you did it in that book too, in part because you wanted to emphasize what an enormous effort it was, how it was kind of wrenched out of her. And then you're going to face her with the prospect that maybe the book she worked so hard and so heartbreakingly to finish isn't over, that maybe the story she told isn't the real story, and maybe she's going to have to throw this whole book away and start over. And I thought that contrast, you know, was
That's exactly true, and not only that really, but that she doesn't even totally like what she's written. She's not totally satisfied with it.
Well, I think she's not felt that the narrative was convincing.
Yeah.
And as it turns out,
but it wasn't.
There was a reason why it wasn't convincing. But going back to the first book, another question that I would love to know about is why Florida? I mean, you live in Kansas. Your Jenny Kane books were set in New England, although you did come to Kansas for Bum Steer, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
Jenny, you know, made it to the Midwest. And the Virginia Rich books were kind of all over. I mean, you were in Tucson, you were in Colorado, and you were in Rhode Island. Why Florida?
Well, first I would say the reason I very rarely write in my own home area is that I have a hard time writing in areas where I am. I need distance to write.
Okay. Kind of like James Joyce being in Paris and writing about Dublin?
If you want to compare it to James Joyce, that's just fine, but yes, right.
Well, but I've often said that I think that distance does matter, that many people write better as expatriates or exiles, if you will, that you're right, that distance allows you to be. The danger, of course, is that you fall out of touch.
Oh, yeah.
And then you're no longer credible about the area because it's evolved away from you.
That's right.